Before discussing some of these private military contractors and their surrounding milieu, let's talk about the influence industry itself and the U.S. legislation that had to pass in order to make domestic, state-sponsored influence operations legal. How was this possible? Was it always possible? The Smith-Mundt Act was a nearly 70-year piece of bipartisan legislation that banned such activities. The consensus, spanning over a half-century, was that U.S. state-sponsored dissemination of propaganda should take its, quote, rightful place in the graveyard of Cold War relics, end quote. The Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, however, first spurred on by the Heritage Foundation, finally repealed this legislation, making state-sponsored domestic influence campaigns legal yet again. This was passed in 2013 as part of that year's National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, an annual omnibus defense spending bill. This is a common theme we will see among this type of legislation, passed under the veil of national security imperatives. And without notice, after nearly a century of bipartisan support, the prohibition of domestic, state-sponsored operations was lifted. There's a Northwestern University Law Review publication by Weston R. Sager titled Apple Pie Propaganda, the Smith-Mundt Act Before and After the Repeal of the Domestic Dissemination Ban. This publication goes on in great detail about how the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act offers no transparency, accountability, or guardrails for these U.S. state-run influence campaigns that vary from one presidential administration to another. This paper found it noteworthy that despite the voluminous congressional record surrounding the nearly 70-year-old Smith-Mundt Act, the record of its final repeal is sparse, albeit its first attempt in 2010 when it failed to gain traction with lawmakers for fear of its weaponization by the executive branch and an ever-changing U.S. president to unduly influence and prevent free American public discourse. Just prior to the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, the counter-violent extremism ecosystem first began. This was born out of the U.S. State Department's Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication, or CSCC, established in 2011. But just months after the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act was passed into law in 2013, the CSCC expanded to include domestic audiences. Its first domestic operation, called Think Again, Turn Away. This influence operation was conducted to prevent Americans and Europeans from joining jihadist groups. Think Again, Turn Away was a widely accepted, abject failure, inciting more division and extremism than it countered. The CSCC and its operations were then reformulated into the Global Engagement Center, or GEC, also by executive order of Obama in the final months of his presidency. This broadened the scope of these domestic operations even further to address activities from other threats as well. Domestic audiences were no longer subject to these state-sponsored influence operations, solely viewed as potential victims of jihadist recruits. Domestic audiences could now be included as potential extremists themselves, ambiguously labeled as non-state actors. Just a few short months after the formation of the GEC, during the 2016 presidential transition period, Obama then signed the annual NDAA that now permits the military to provide material support for the newly formed GEC and their domestic influence operations. And yet, just a couple short weeks after that, also during the 2016 presidential transition period, Obama's GEC, within his State Department, signed a contract with a military contractor known as SCL Group to develop strategies to influence extremist, non-state actors, and potential recruits. This contract of Obama's State Department stated that throughout his entire presidency, his administration was, quote, not aware of any companies that approach the sophistication and effectiveness of SCL in designing data-driven influence campaigns that demonstrably work. The now defunct SCL Group was a military contractor specializing in strategic communications, or STRATCOM. This is an influence industry that, at the time, was incorporating artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and big data within its defense operations to modify cognitive brain function to achieve attitude and behavioral change of entire populations. SCL deployed its weapons-grade communications tactics in perception operations all around the world for crisis management, government nudge units, and on behalf of states and militaries to counter extremism, insurgency, and terrorism, both domestic and abroad. SCL is what reintroduced the term STRATCOM back into the lexicon of NATO and was foundational to its STRATCOM planning loop. One example of these military-industrial complexities and the political bipartisanship of this industry is SCL Group. Look no further. SCL was hired by Obama's administration for not only the aforementioned State Department contract, but also counter-operation contracts in the Middle East for his Department of Defense, all after top executives of SCL worked on Obama's 2012 presidential campaign utilizing early data science. Then the UK Parliament determined that this military contractor then bypassed US election laws the following election in 2016 to work on the Republican presidential campaign. And wouldn't you know, just a couple weeks after that, during this presidential transition period, Obama's State Department then gave SCL the contract to develop these influence operations on non-state actor extremists. Operations that the incumbent Republican administration would then first deploy and oversee. Republicans, Democrats, the military-industrial complex does not see politics beyond its operational use case. The military-industrial complex is now just one of many multi-billion-dollar industries monetarily incentivized to continue this domestic war on terror. And like all other counterinsurgency and counter-extremism efforts around the world, it's a domestic war with no stated goals, metrics of operational success, and seemingly no end in sight. This is an excerpt from the NDAA of 2017 that Obama signed into law during the 2016 presidential transition period. It lists just some of the other industries that also now monetarily benefit from continuing these domestic U.S. military operations. Civil society groups, media content providers, NGOs, federally funded research and development centers, private companies, academic institutions, etc., etc., etc. All of them hired to provide narratives beneficial to an ever-changing executive branch of the U.S. President, acting through its newly formed Global Engagement Center, or GEC. These are just the organizations and groups that provide the narratives. A lot of focus is paid to the industries that provide the narratives. But the industry that provides states and militaries with the capability to algorithmically push these narratives through the bloodstream of the internet is known as strategic communications, or STRATCOM, and zero focus is paid to the STRATCOM field of private military contractors such as SCL Group. And there is no transparency as to what narratives are being disseminated by the ever-changing executive branch of the U.S. presidency through its GEC, using its STRATCOM weaponry in these domestic operations that can modify cognitive brain function to effectuate behavioral change. The same STRATCOM weaponry field-tested by NATO, making professional soldiers defect from their military and their country and cause national security problems, creating Manchurian candidates solely using data and artificial intelligence. According to NATO STRATCOM Director Janice Sartz,
we attempted to see whether we can change what soldiers do during a military exercise, and we were able to make professional soldiers briefed on information security to disobey orders, leave the positions they're supposed to defend, reconnaissance units to reveal their GPS locations at the time we wanted. Just from understanding from a data set how they think as humans, what they are, what they believe, what they trust, what they do like, what they don't like. And from that understanding, kind of issue what we called effect that shifted the behavior. That is where we're going. And that is where we will be ending at some point in time, sooner rather than later. That big data that is kind of identifiable with an individual, combined with a kind of efficient AI systems, will enable manipulation and behavior change of larger masses of people. And the technology is being fine-tuned as we speak, both in a kind of election setup, but also in some authoritarian systems for citizen control setup.